Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Today in African History with Baba Shaka. Of course, I'm Baba Shaka. And today is the first of a series that we're going to attempt to do this year. We're going to attempt to do 365 short clips on things that have taken place in the African world, both on the continent and in the diaspora. Okay? We're going to start off with January 1st because that's what today is. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about this flag that you see behind me because I've heard this flag being described as the African American flag. I've also even read that, this is the African American flag. And no, it's not. It's not an African American flag. This is actually the unity flag. And this flag was actually developed back in August of 1920 by the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, who at that time was the founder and the leader of the UNIA, or the United Negro Improvement Association. This is one of the biggest mass movements of black people the world has ever seen. The UNIA had chapters all over the United States. They had chapters in South America and Central America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe. Okay, and apparently there was a song that came out sometime in early 1920, and one line of the song said, "Everyone has a flag but the coon," and of course the term coon was a derogatory term that was used to describe African people at that time. Well, guess what? The Honorable Marcus Garvey came up with this flag and said, now we have a flag. We as African people have a flag, whether we're on the continent or in the diaspora. This is our flag, the red, black, and green. Of course, the red is for the blood of that signify the struggle that our people have gone through for so many years. The black, of course, represents the people, wherever we may be found. And the green represents the richness of the African continent. Okay, so this flag, one of the results of this flag is that if you check a lot of the flags of African countries, and even some of the countries in the Caribbean, countries that of course got their independence back starting in 1957 and moving forward and developing their own flags, they incorporated, many of them incorporated these colors into their flags. You check the flag of Kenya, check the flag of Ghana, check the flag of St. Kitts and Nevis, and many, many others. You'll find these three colors, red, black, and green, incorporated into these national flags. So this flag represents not just African Americans, but it represents African people wherever we may be found. If you're in Nigeria, this is your flag. If you're in South Africa, this is your flag. If you're in Jamaica, this is your flag. If you're in Guyana, this is your flag. If you're in New York, your flag. And if you're in Texas, you got it. This is your flag. So just wanted to clear that up. This is the unity flag, the Pan-African flag, not just the African American flag. Well, today, January 1st. Now, Americans are likely to think of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day as a time to celebrate the fresh start and the new year the fresh start in the new year that represents. But there's also a troubling side to the holidays' history. In the years before the Civil War, the first day of the new year was often a heartbreaking one for enslaved African people in the United States. In the African community, New Year's Day used to be widely known as Hiring Day or Heartbreak Day, as African African American abolitionist journalist William Cooper Nell described it, because enslaved people spent New Year's Eve waiting, wondering if their owners were going to rent them out to someone else, thus potentially splitting up their families. The renting out of slave labor was a relatively common practice in the Antebellum South and a profitable practice for white slave owners and hirers. Mhm. Hiring Day was part of the large economic cycle in which most debts were collected and settled on New Year's Day, says Alexis McCrossan, an expert on the history of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day and a professor of history at the Southern Methodist University, who writes about Hiring Day in her book, Time's Touchstone: The New Year in American Life. I recommend that we all get that book, okay? Some enslaved people were put up for auction that day. or held under contracts that started in January. These transactions also took place all year round, and contracts could last for different amounts of time. These deals were conducted privately among families, friends, business contacts, and slaves were handed over in town squares, on courthouse steps, and sometimes simply by the side of the road, according to Divided Mastery, Slave Hiring in the American South by Jonathan D. Martin. Remember that. Divided Mastery, Slave Hiring in the American South by Jonathan D. Martin. Check that out. Accounts of the cruelty of hiring day come from records left by those who secured their freedom, who describe spending the day before January 1st, hoping and praying that their hirers would be humane and that their families could possibly stay together. Of all the days in the year, the slaves dread New Year's Day the worst of any. An enslaved brother by the name of Lewis Clark said in an 1842 account. On New Year's Day, we went to the auctioneer's block to be hired to the highest bidder for 1 year. It says Israel Campbell wrote in a memoir published in 1861 in Philadelphia, in which he describes being hired out 3 times. That's where that saying comes from, that what you do on New Year's Day, you'll be doing for the rest of the year. A former enslaved sister by the name of Sister Harrison said in an interview in 1937. Harriet Jacobs wrote a particularly detailed account in The Slave's New Year's Day chapter of her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Hiring Day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd of January, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters, she wrote. She observed slave owners and farmers renting out their human chattel for extra income during this period between the cotton and corn harvest and the next planting season. From Christmas to New Year's Eve, many families would wait anxiously to find out whether they would be rented out and to whom. On New Year's Day, at the appointed hour, the grounds were thronged with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doom pronounced, Jacobs wrote. On one of these fateful days, Jacob saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The slave trader who took the children wouldn't tell her where he was taking them because it depended on where he could get the highest price, Jacob said. She would never forget the mother crying out, "Gone, all gone. Why don't God kill me?" Enslaved people who attempted to resist going to their new masters were whipped and thrown in jail until they relented and promised not to run away during the new arrangement. Old enslaved people were also particularly vulnerable, as Jacobs described one owner trying to hire out a frail, roughly 70-year-old woman because he was moving away. But the history of New Year's and American slavery is not all horror. The holiday was also associated with freedom. The federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade went into effect on New Year's Day in 1808, and enslaved African communities did celebrate, but the festivities were short lived. Different slave trade abolition commemorations took place between 1808 and 1831, but they died out because the domestic slave trade was so vigorous, says McCrossan. The risk of violence was also too great. For example, on New Year's Eve in 1827 in New York City, a white mob attacked the, the African congregants and vandalized their church. Attacked them and vandalized their church. The holiday became more associated with freedom than slavery when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the Confederate States on New Year's Day in 1863. The enslaved went to church to pray and sing on December 31st, 1862, and that's why there's still a New Year's Eve prayer service at African American churches nationwide. At such watch night services, congregants continue to pray for more widespread racial equality more than 150 years later. And that what happened in African history on January 1st. This is our first broadcast, so please hit the subscribe button down below and share this with your friends and make some comments. Maybe you like what we have to say, maybe you didn't. Just make a comment, let us know what you like or what you didn't. All right. Until tomorrow, masalam.